Welcome to Better Health Guy Blogcasts, empowering your better health. And now, here's Scott, your Better Health Guy. The content of this show is for informational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any illness or medical condition. Nothing in today's discussion is meant to serve as medical advice or as information to facilitate self-treatment. As always, please discuss any potential health-related decisions with your own personal medical authority.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 76 of the Better Health Guy blogcast series. Today's guest is Dr. Zach Bush, and the topic of the show is Restore and Hydration. Dr. Zach Bush is one of the few triple board-certified physicians in the country with expertise in internal medicine, endocrinology and metabolism, and hospice and palliative care. The breakthrough science that Dr. Bush and his colleagues have delivered offer profound new insights into human health and longevity. In 2012, he discovered a family of carbon-based redox molecules made by bacteria. He and his team subsequently demonstrated that this cellular communication network functions to compensate for glyphosate and many other dietary, chemical, and pharmaceutical toxins that disrupt our body's natural defense systems. This science has resulted in a revolutionary class of dietary supplements, including the product Restore. Dr. Bush points to his kids as the driving force behind his passion for change. He is fiercely motivated by a desire to have them experience a much brighter and healthier future. His education efforts provide a grassroots foundation from which we can launch change in our legislative decisions, ultimately upshifting consumer behavior to bring about radical change in the mega industries of big farming, big pharma, and Western medicine at large. And now my interview with Dr. Zach Bush. I first had the opportunity to meet Dr. Zach Bush at Autism One in 2015 and have been a follower of his work since then. So much of chronic ill health starts in the gut. And this is an area where Dr. Bush has come up with some very helpful strategies and solutions. Thanks so much for being here, Dr. Bush.
Really a pleasure to be on. I appreciate you having me.
It's great to have you. How did you move from a more conventional medical focus to a more integrative and alternative focus in terms of dealing with complex health challenges? Did you have a health experience of your own that was kind of the catalyst for that shift?
To some degree. I think the slip for me was intellectual one before biologic issues occurred. I was starting to run into a real intellectual roadblock where I'd been a practicing physician for 8 years and had really, trained in some of the best programs in the world in internal medicine and endocrinology and metabolism, and was watching my patients with diabetes, metabolic disease, and then my basic science and clinical research was all in cancer. And so I had this broad breadth of clinical and basic science research going on, and was watching the tools that I had been taught were supposed to be really getting at, our best shot at cures, just making people worse and not better over time, and watching this slippery slope of the allopathic model, play out in my patients. And that was the crisis that hit me, was more of one of self-identity in some ways. Here I'd gone into medicine to become a healer and a caretaker, and felt like my tools were adding flame to the fire rather than shutting down any intrinsic process there. So that was the journey for me, was looking for answers. Part of that I tried to meet through just more and more education. Went through 3 years of internal medicine, then on faculty as a chief resident, then 3 more years of endocrinology and metabolism. All of that after 4 years of medical school. So by the time I've been in for 17 years in that academic environment, I felt like, okay, I really can't climb too much higher in this model. So then I started looking more, out to the sides and skirting outside of the box. And that's when I found nutrition. And nutrition was my entry point into the gut ultimately, and now where my basic science research and all my laboratory work is focused on the role of the microbiome in human health and how that unfolds.
That is a very compelling story, and I know you're changing lots of lives today, so this is really exciting. Talk to us a little bit about the role of leaky gut or intestinal hyperpermeability in chronic illnesses and systemic health conditions. What is it, and what are some of the top insults that we face today that impact our gut lining and ultimately our systemic health?
Excellent. Yeah. So it's so interesting. Like, it's hard to even pick up like a lay public magazine these days that doesn't mention gut health somewhere in it. And so it might be talking about probiotics, it might be talking about prebiotics, but it's talking about gut health. And the interesting thing when you read anything from the lay public kind of press all the way to the science at the highest levels from Stanford and MIT and all the rest, nobody's really defining gut health. And that's been, this obvious lesion in this subject matter is what is a gut? What is a healthy gut? And ultimately it comes down to what your question regard is, which is the permeability of the intestinal wall. The intestinal wall is an extremely dynamic boundary. It should be this, barrier to the outside world that protects you from all the junk out there. Pollen, dust, pollution. Then you ingest water. It's got heavy metals in it. It's got light metals. It's got plastics. It's got all kinds of weird contaminants. It's got medications in there, right? So your water you're drinking has statin drugs. It has hormones from people's birth control in there. And so you got all of this junk. And so your gut is supposed to be this barrier system to keep all the toxin out. And that doesn't just include man-made stuff. It also includes a lot of organic material. And so many of you who've had leaky gut diagnosed have probably experienced when you eat a salad, kale and other incredible superfoods, you actually feel worse, not better when you've got leaky gut. More bloating, more sluggishness, more achiness, like your inflammation markers can actually go up on health food. And that was really what started me down this avenue. As I had started at my own nutrition center in 2010. And 2 years into that journey, we were just like hitting the wall with the reality. Like, there's a good 30 or 40% of our patients that are getting worse, not better, on the best nutrition on the planet. How is that possible? I didn't believe in leaky gut at the time. I'd heard the term, thought it was made up by chiropractors. I thought it was, some, kind of wives' tale kind of situation. And then started to really witness it, in my patients front and center. And so that journey really took me down with the beginning of the question of, well, has something just fundamentally changed in the nutrition? Because I was reading great nutrition science from the 1970s and 80s from Colin Campbell and, Esselstyn from Cleveland Clinic and all these, founders of the field of, plant-based medicine. And I was applying those to the best of my abilities and really believing by this time that my patients were implementing it just as directed. So that reality of, okay, we're eating the right foods and it's making us sicker. And that brought us back to the soil. And we kind of went, retrospective here. Like I didn't prospectively say, oh, it must be leaky gut. First, what we found was a bunch of molecules made by bacteria and fungi. They looked a lot like the chemotherapy I used to make. And so I made this kind of leap in my head of like, oh, I wonder if these would have an effect on cancer cells and cancer health and all of that. And so we put that into clinical trials. Basic science looked really good, put it into clinical trials, and we started seeing all kinds of off-target effects. Decreased inflammation, decreased autoimmune reactivity, decreased sensitivity to the environment, decreased gluten sensitivity. Like all of these things were happening within days of starting, this dirt supplement. And we had to really bring it back to our PhD lead, which is John Gilday. And he really was the one to really start to tease out, I think this is getting at the root cause of leaky gut. And he had been spent about 10 years by that time following the story of, second part of your question, which are the things that trigger leaky gut. And he'd been following one of the major pieces, which is glyphosate. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup. Roundup is the most common weed killer on the planet. We spray 4.5 billion pounds of this active ingredient on the soils of the earth every year now worldwide. It's a huge problem for lots of reasons, but one of the major issues with this chemical, which is an organophosphate, it's a cousin to Agent Orange, the defoliating thing that we dumped on the jungles of Vietnam, and of course that caused skin burns and cancer almost immediately. So it's slightly less toxic than Agent Orange, but in the same family. And the problem with glyphosate or Roundup is it's water soluble. The reason that's a problem is 70% of our planet, including 70% of our body, is water. And so once you put a water soluble toxin in, it can go everywhere in the system. And so currently it's in our drinking water, it's in our rainwater, it's in the air we breathe. 75% of samples taken in the US are positive for Roundup. It's in our mother's milk that the babies are drinking. It's just everywhere that you would find water, you're going to find this molecule, including inside our plants. You think of, oh, my GMO crop got sprayed with Roundup. I should wash off my Well, no, that stuff got absorbed through the root system up into the plant, and you're eating Roundup as much as you're drinking it. You think of all these homeowners, and you may be one of them that's got a backpack or a sprayer of Roundup in your garage for the dandelions around your yard. You got to realize that's going right into the water table, washing out into your gutters, and ending up in your municipal water system. And so whether it's homeowner use, agriculture use, spraying GMO crops that are Roundup ready, that would be sugar beet, corn, soybean. 85% of all of our crops in the United States also includes the staple crops of wheat, lentils, beans. There, all of these, things have been sprayed with this chemical. And so that glyphosate is undermining the permeability or the barrier system of your gut lining and create this global leaky gut phenomenon. So I think that was a super roundabout answer.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. So let's talk about this dirt as you referred to it. So what is Restore? Where does it come from? What is lignite or terrahydrite? And then is there something about this substance once it's extracted from the soil that's done to it to give it these unique properties or not?
Great. Yeah. So Restore is the dietary supplement line we've developed. It also includes a sinonasal product that's just a nasal spray for improving general sinus condition there. So you're looking for support to this global membrane. Your gut begins at your nasal membranes, runs all the way to the rectum. It's tied together by tight junctions, which are those Velcro-like proteins. So what we had found was that in the soil, we were studying soil science, trying to find a reason why our food was making people more inflamed. And what we found was a family of molecules that we now refer to as terrahydrite. It's millions of different variants of a carbon-ringed molecule that has oxygen-hydrogen binding potential on the right-hand side of it as it draws out in a diagram. And so it was that oxygen-hydrogen binding that I recognized from my chemotherapy development as being a potential communication network. There's a whole field of science now called redox biochemistry. That's the contraction of the words reduction and oxidation into the word redox. Reduction is the donation of electron. Oxidation is the absorption of an electron in any biochemical reaction. A redox molecule is capable of participating in rapid exchange of hydrogen and electrons to create a pulse of electricity through a cellular environment to induce a communication network. Picture this very much like the wireless communication between cell phones. So your cell phone's got a computer in there that can both transmit and receive signal all the time. If you're further than 7 miles from the closest cell phone tower, that cell phone is now rendered useless. It can't communicate with anybody around the world. It's now isolated. And it starts to fragment. The software programs start to fragment. It can't do its updates and repairs. So you start to get a dissolving or diseasing infrastructure of your cell phone. Exact same thing we are now finding is happening in human biology is that as we isolate ourselves away from the microbiome, we start to lose this carbon matrix communication network of redox signaling in that extracellular matrix in the extracellular environment, and we start to become isolated at the cell level. Now the cell doesn't know what to make. Should I make proteins for the extracellular matrix? Should I make phospholipids for over here? Should I, what should I be making from my genes, from my genome to produce a healthy cell today? Once you're too far away from that wireless signal, the whole system starts to fragment. Now, what we found in the soil was that the more complex the microbiome is that you sample from, the more variants of these carbon molecules you get. Each species of fungi, each species of bacteria seems capable of doing its own kind of manufacturing of its own unique niche of this communication network. Almost picture it like a vocabulary. You have this huge fluent vocabulary of microbiome speech, and a few words are made by each species. And so as a total community, we get this fluent communication, and we can do a lot of work making proteins of many, many different variants. And some of these are proteins like structural proteins, like the tight junctions. That's what we see with Restore, for example. You put that into a small intestine or a colon, you see very rapid production of the protein matrix, the tight junctions that hold that into an intelligent membrane. Therefore, really getting at the root cause of why does leaky gut occur? Leaky gut occurs because the cell doesn't know it's supposed to make tight junctions. The cell's just sitting there. It's got all the machinery to make those proteins. It's got the DNA template to make the proteins, but everything's sitting quiet because it doesn't realize its situation. you put this carbon matrix back into play, and suddenly all the cells be like, oh, I'm a small intestine membrane. I need to make tight junctions. I need to get a coherent barrier built. And that happens within minutes. So the more we have found about the carbon matrix, the faster we have to believe biology heals. And that's an exciting story of kind of grace at the cellular level. Your question was really pertaining to what is Restore. So it's a carbon matrix of molecules made by a diverse microbiome. The place we get that is from fossil soils. It turns out that the soil levels have been decreasing for many millennia, not just the last 50 years. The biggest decimation has been over that last kind of really 150 years. Ever since the late 1800s, we really stopped doing crop rotation, composting, all that, and we started to go to artificial farming techniques. And eventually by the mid-1900s, by 1945, we were using petroleum-based products for fertilizers, the NPK fertilizers. We were using petroleum chemical-based products for herbicides, pesticides, and we really went into chemical production of our entire food system by the 1990s. So that has been a slippery slope. But if we look back to the fossil record, we realize that ever since the dinosaurs, we've been seeing this steady creep of drop of density in that topsoil, reflecting a drop in the amount of microbial life present there. And so we've accelerated as humans through our technological nightmare, an acceleration of something that's been happening for a long time. The excitement that we've had over this is that when we take these molecules out of soil that's 50 to 60 million years old, we get a matrix or a variety of this kind of circuit board of liquid molecules that is extremely intelligent. And it gives you goosebumps when you really start to realize humans have never been around this degree of intelligence from the microbiome. What happens when humans rise to the highest level of soil intelligence we've ever had? And we're seeing remarkable things because the human has all the template for health and healing, and it gets turned on by this huge complex matrix. So Restore, extracted from fossil soils. It's not the first soil extract. It's notable that there was shilajit and there was humic acids and fulvic acids on the market. And so these are age-old compounds from the soil. The difference between Restore and all of those previous kind of extracts is they were really going for mineral delivery. They were trying to get these minerals delivered into the body through different methodologies. And the downside of all three of those categories, the fulvic acid, the humic acid, the shilajit, these are all very oxidative, meaning they tear electrons off the surface of things. So if we put those in communication with human kidney cells, which are kind of our canary in the coal mine, we do great damage. We increase apoptosis and cell death in those kidney cells. And so we knew we had to figure out some way to get this oxidative fossil soil extracts to a state where it was non-oxidative. We needed to get into a balanced redox state where it could reduce as well as absorb electrons. And so that was the journey for the catalyst process that we use in our laboratories here in Virginia. So fossil soil extracts, put it through catalyst systems, get hydrogen and oxygen binding back activated, then you can show really excellent safety of the product. So we far outstrip the safety of fulvic acids, humic acids, and the like. Non-oxidative soil supplement that's not delivering minerals intentionally. It does have about 64 trace minerals in there, has amino acids in there that are all kind of naturally occurring. You'd find them in the skin of a sweet potato, for example. Any root vegetable, you look at the matrix of their skin, they're going to have the same amino acid mineral complex that you would find in Restore. They are trace, though. This is nowhere near what you would call a mineral supplement that would replace something like, if somebody feels like they're really deplete in magnesium or deplete in manganese or selenium. If they're really deplete in a micronutrient, Restore's a very trace amount. I wouldn't say, oh, go stop that. You're now on Restore. You're good to go. Restore is about the communication network, not about just delivering minerals and
So is the Restore solution then, is it both directly helping with the leaky gut scenario as well as providing this communication network, or is it the provisioning of this communication network that then is helping to deal with the leaky gut?
The latter. Yeah, we're very excited about Restore because we think it's one of the very first compounds on the shelf of your physician's office or a health food store, wherever you're picking this up, that's not trying to do anything. That's what makes it so safe. This is not trying to do any cell signaling. It's not trying to make you produce any proteins. It's not trying to make you do anything at the body level or at the cellular level. Instead, it's simply that wireless communication network so that one cell can figure out what is its role in the setting of 70 trillion cells. And that's where we really changed the terrain for health and disease, is getting your intrinsic human health system up and running. And so that's our excitement with Restore. It's a very subtle, non-direct approach to very rapid activation of your intrinsic healing process.
And so that communication network is not just related to the microbiome, but to any of the cells that it comes in contact with?
Exactly. And so the extraordinary journey that we've had is to realize that this is not a communication network just for the microbiome. We certainly see that happen. We've seen people with sterile guts. They have, no organic life left in their intestines after rounds and rounds of chemotherapy and antibiotics. They have what we call white chalk stools. It looks like a little piece of white chalk about the size of your pinky finger that will pass from their rectum every 3 days or so. What that is just epithelial skin lining of their intestines that sloughs off every 3 days and turns into this little compressed, epithelial cell chunk that looks like a piece of chalk and passes. So they have no microbiome left. Put them on a sterile compound of Restore, and within 4 days we see restoration of a normal brown bowel movement. That was, brain numbing and confusing the first time that happened. And we had to go look for the reason. How does a sterile compound return life to the gut? Well, we found the communication network of the biome. And so now you have a niche within each of those, the whole segment of the microbiome saying, oh my gosh, we need more acidophilus, we need more lactobacillus, we need more, Bacteroides, we need more firmicutes. The communication network goes up and suddenly you're like, oh my gosh, we need to pull this from our environment all over the place. And so we're pulling all of that in largely, in fact, from the breath, not even eating it. One of our very first patients to go from chalk stools to normal bowel movements in 4 days had a total bowel obstruction from pancreatic cancer. And so she couldn't even swallow water. And yet in just 4 days of swabbing the mouth, getting that going, we see microbiome return. And that was really because she had this wonderful lap dog that would run outside, dig around the dirt, come up, jump in her face, lick her face all over, and she's breathing and she's getting absorption of the microbiome, and the Restore is providing a new foundation for that microbiome to set up and work from. So communication network for the microbiome, then communication number 2 for the mitochondria. These guys live inside of your cells, and with you guys, in the population you're listening to this show, a lot of you have Lyme disease or have been diagnosed with chronic Lyme. That condition is historically one of the classic situations where the mitochondrial reactive oxygen species get stuck at a very high level. You're just dumping oxidation into the body all the time. What we see with this microbiome communication network is an immediate effect on the mitochondria to reduce their reactive oxygen species within any healthy human cell. If the cell is so damaged that it needs to turn over, then it actually has the opposite effect, where the microbiome communication comes in, the cell recognizes, oh my gosh, I'm part of a larger biologic system, I'm so damaged I can't repair, I'm going to induce apoptosis. So we see this divergence within minutes of exposure. Heavily damaged cells apoptose and die, so that makes room for cell turnover. And your healthy cell population reduces their reactive oxygen species so that they can rise in production and reduce the absorption of your coping mechanisms like your antioxidants. You don't want your healthy cells demanding a bunch of work from your antioxidant system. You want your antioxidant system to go take care of the real damaged environment. So it really is a reallocation at the mitochondrial level of important human resources, which are, we've got a limited supply of antioxidants, cytokines, helper T cells, the sweeper cells within your immune system called the macrophage. So you've got all these, cellular resources for doing damage control and repair. And once you've been exposed to Lyme or mold toxin or other activators, mitochondria get stuck on, dumping oxidation all over the body, and you're always in this pro-inflammatory state. Even though the Lyme's probably gone, whatever mold triggered it's gone, but you're now in this stuck state. And so the microbiome seems capable of, reestablishing communication down to these incredible mitochondria, which again are non-human. They look like bacteria. Their DNA looks more like a virus. They proliferate inside your cells. The average human cell at age 1 has about 200 mitochondria in every single cell, not like the 3 little mitochondria you see in a biology textbook. There's 200 of those suckers packed in the cell. Cytoplasm should be crammed full of mitochondria. In a neuron, you'll see 2,000 mitochondria in a single axon or a single neural body. And so we're just crammed full of these little critters. And the microbiome is speaking directly to those guys to regulate everything from metabolism to apoptosis or programmed cell suicide. Another big word there is autophagy, which is kind of the die-off of damaged cells, and then calling in repair, everything from intrinsic cellular repair, which is things like DNA polymerase, which cleans up DNA injuries, to big mechanisms of repair. Make proteins for the extracellular matrix, make proteins for more enzyme digestion of toxins, upregulate our intrinsic detox pathways. All of that needs to be turned back on as you get the microbiome communication. Finally, then you get that communication down to that human level. So that's what I just described. So first you have communication between the microbiome, you get repopulation of the microbiome, then you get communication of the mitochondria, you get activation of damaged cells, you get relaxation of the healthy cells, then you get direct human cell communication, which is which cells do my DNA as a human need to make right now? What are not cells, but what is the proteins that I need to make?
So I think when Restore kind of first came onto the market, everyone thought of it primarily as affecting the gut. And then I heard you in one talk about the effects on the extracellular matrix, for example, which in people with chronic conditions is often very toxic and is a focus of some detoxification efforts. So does Restore have an effect on the extracellular matrix as well?
Yes. So the tight junction is just one of these components of this system. And we think of that as being primarily a gut environment that's dealing with this tight junction extracellular matrix injury. But what we've now shown is that as soon as the gut is exposed to these toxins, you start to get tight junction breakdown there. Zonulin, which is one of the main proteins that are made by the gut lining to loosen the tight junction, you get zonulin toxin produced, and that loosens tight junctions. That now opens up the blood-brain barrier. And so you've got blood vessels all over your body that become leaky, and particularly at the blood-brain barrier getting leaky. Since all the blood vessels in the body are leaking, that is also going to directly affect your kidney. So the kidney is a huge extracellular matrix tangle that holds together these capillaries into these bundles of blood vessels that are responsible for filtering out all of the toxins in your blood. Both toxins are made within your cells, normal metabolites like urea and these nitrogen compounds that need to be cleared out of the body after metabolism, all the way to real toxins, heavy metals, the glyphosate chemical itself, all the rest. And so once you've developed, a leaky gut on the front end, you've also developed leaky kidney, you've developed leaky brain, your whole extracellular matrix is starting to get diseased, as you referenced there. And we see this with Lyme. I believe that actually the Lyme spirochete is being called in by our population because of damage to the extracellular matrix. We get toxic on compounds we can't break down. But it turns out that the Lyme spirochete, the Borrelia, is actually very good at breaking down things like sulfides and a lot of these chemical compounds that we don't have a metabolic pathway for. The Lyme spirochete is called a chemoheterotroph. Chemoheterotrophs can actually chew up some of these toxins that are produced during the inflammatory process with Roundup and leaky gut, leaky brain, all this stuff. And when we look at electron microscopy of patients who have Lyme disease, you don't see an infestation of a bunch of Lyme spirochetes, chewing up a section of tissue. You never see that under the microscope. What you'll see is one little spirochete traveling through a tissue plane, and it's traveling along the extracellular matrix. It's my suspicion, and I think we're going to probably prove this out in the next few years, if not us, then somebody else in the field is going to prove out that spirochete's actually doing detox. It's actually cleaning up a system that's diseased. And here we keep telling our Lyme patients, oh, you've got Lyme, you need more antibiotic, and we keep killing the freaking Lyme. And we wonder why our chronic Lyme patients are chronically fatigued, chronic pain, chronic inflammation. Well, it's because we took away the detox potential of the microbiome by continuing this antibiotic exposure. So it's not just Borrelia, but I think every piece of the microbiome we're now realizing, Pseudomonas, Clostridium. These are two things that we think of as pathogens, but we've already shown that these have really important detox pathways. Clostridium actually can help break down glyphosate or Roundup. So I think one of the reasons we have C. diff colitis becoming so prominent is we have so much Roundup integrated into the human gut that there's a role for Clostridium. Pseudomonas actually digests radioactive material. Radioactive isotopes are digested by, Fukushima being a good example, we have still dumping 1 million gallons of radioactive seawater back into the ocean every single day from Fukushima now, years after the accident. And so we've got toxic fish, we've got toxic air coming out of that's got radioactive isotope in it. And so we're breathing it, we're eating it, we're drinking radioactive. So Pseudomonas has a role. We're going to find out that every piece of the microbiome is there to help support and promote human health, not try to kill us.
And that's something that my mentor, Dr. Dietrich Klinghart's talked about for a while with parasites as well, right? That they have the potential or the opportunity to bring heavy metals in the body and kind of concentrate them in such a way that they're then not as damaging to the system overall. And it also, I think your comments about the toxicity and the impact of that on Lyme disease, I've always been of the opinion that detoxification was probably the most important thing you could do in trying to recover from something like Lyme disease. And it sounds like you're also suggesting that it's really the terrain and the toxicity that's the big player there.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Once you've triggered the mitochondrial stress by the exposure to Lyme, the exposure to it doesn't need to be Lyme. Many of you actually had probably a viral gastroenteritis or some other viral exposure that triggered this thing, and it's been blamed on Lyme. You test negative for Lyme, or you have a couple of non-specific markers for Lyme, and the doctors keep saying, you have Lyme, you have Lyme, you have Lyme. Well, it's just as likely you had a virus, or you had a parasite, or you had something else that just slightly tweaked your immune system response to activate your mitochondria into an inflammatory reactive oxygen state and decreased your production of the antioxidant system. Glutathione synthase is made by your genome, and so it's a big enzyme produced by an important gene within your DNA. It gets that gene, the promoter region, gets locked down when exposed to large amounts of Lyme toxin or large amounts of mold toxins. It probably gets shut down for good reason in the short run, but it should be then reversed by the microbiome. The problem we now have is we're drenched in glyphosate, which is an antibiotic. I didn't mention that, but it's never been patented as a weed killer. It's been patented as an antibiotic, antiparasite, antifungal. It kills single cellular life. It kills parasites. It's a nasty bugger when it comes to the microbiome. And so now that we're depleting the microbiome, we can't respond correctly to the Lyme pathogen. Do you remember your grandparents having lots of chronic Lyme in their generation?
No.
They never heard of it, right? They didn't have chronic arthritic conditions from tick bites. Nobody feared ticks until the 1980s, 1990s, and then especially in 2000, 2010, that's when we saw these huge epidemics of Lyme coming into the population. Well, is that really an epidemic of Lyme? Or is that a depleted microbiome that now can't make the adjustment when Lyme is around, and you've got this increased toxicity? So Lyme now needs to, is being drawn in, literally called into your body because of all of the sulfides and other compounds are there. And so your toxic environment from your food chain is calling in the Lyme. You may or may not have gotten bit by a tick. It's notable that we have spirochetes all over our microbiome, and the Borrelia burgdorferi, which we call the Lyme pathogen, that's the least of the spirochetes in our body. We have spirochetes all over the place, probably doing important different niches within the cleanup process. If you go to Europe, they don't have Borrelia burgdorferi. It's a completely different spirochete over there that causes Lyme disease. Well, we need to stop calling it Lyme disease and say, oh, the terrain is calling in spirochetes. Why is that? Well, it's probably because the microbiome got screwed up. Why is that? Well, it's probably because we started using high amounts of herbicides and pesticides. So it's this incredible reality of kill the microbiome in the soil with our farming practices, then create a rationale or a reason for that, a terrain for that calls in the spirochetes, and then a medical practice that bombards that with more antibiotics to further deplete and screw up the microbiome. And now it takes us decades to recover from a Lyme exposure.
So if there was an overgrowth of some microbe, is it reasonable to speculate that the restoration of this communication network supporting the return of biodiversity in the microbiome and the gut ecosystem then would lead to an improvement of our immune system's ability to surveil and react more appropriately?
Exactly. So we've proved out in the laboratory now where you expose that, again, it's sterile. There's no microbiome there, but the communication network, and you immediately get the shift in the mitochondria. Take off the stress and do autophagy or cell turnover in the damaged cells. Then you do protein synthesis, repair the boundaries, get the immune system protected by the tight junction system. So now the immune system, which lies in your gut lining, is not getting overwhelmed by every breath you take, every drink of water, every food you take. You start to rebuild your reserve. Then you look downstream and you've really got the opportunity to diversify bowel flora. How do you do that? By getting out in the environment. pets can do this. We've seen dog owners improve their bowel flora. Once they start Restore, they'll see that bowel flora return very quickly. Whereas that dog's been in their environment for a long time, and suddenly it has a foothold. The Restore is giving this compost-like environment to give foothold back to that microbiome that you have the opportunity to absorb from your dog. Then you get well enough, you can go outside. You start hiking. You start spending more time in the garden. You got to get out in the macro environments to reinforce a new micro environment. And so that's a very important message for your group. If you're diagnosed with an overgrowth, Lyme, Candida, fungus, yeast, bacteria, and somebody says, oh, you're overgrown with this species. Well, instead of trying to kill that species, it's probably there for good reason. Your terrain created an advantageous place for that organism to be there. Change the terrain and the organism will back off. It has to, because it won't have the substrate or rationale to be there. And so change the terrain. Change the terrain by changing your macro terrain. What is your lifestyle? What is your day-to-day look like? And if you're a normal American, you wake up in a drywall box we call a house. It's got HVAC system that has abnormal flora in it because it doesn't breathe with the outside world. You then go to your garage, which has got all these hydrocarbons in the air because there's been a gas tank and an oil pan that's sitting there all night off-gassing into the air. You get this hydrocarbon load, and then you get into a car that's lined with plastic, and then you drive out in the hot sun. Plastic is off-gassing all the way to work, and you're blowing air-conditioned air in your face. And then you get to an office, you maybe take 40 steps from the car to the office, and now you're in a mold-infested cubicle that's off-gassing carpet and foam and microbiome weirdness to you all day. And then you reverse the process. So go home to a mattress that's off-gassing weird stuff. So you start to really think about the American lifestyle. You're like, how are any of us even freaking alive?
Absolutely. I wonder that every day. Let's talk about a few applications of Restore. So I know generally when I was doing it, teaspoon 3 times a day. I know some people sometimes have to start with less, that maybe it takes a while for them to be able to tolerate it. Are there some people that benefit from taking even more than 3 teaspoons a day?
Yeah, that whole spectrum. And you can imagine what's going to happen here. So why are some people sensitive to it? Who's sensitive? Well, Lyme patients definitely fall into that category. A lot of Lyme patients will be sensitive. Not all of them. There's a lot of them will just start the 3 teaspoons a day and feel nothing at first, and then it takes them time to start rehydrating and doing all the normal good stuff. But there's a significant portion of the Lyme and the autism patient and anybody else who's really got a screwed up microbiome. Chemotherapy patients sometimes will fall into this category, where they suddenly get more headache, more bloating, more overwhelm of the immune system in those first few days. Well, how is that possible? If we have a completely safe product that we continue to prove at the cellular level has absolutely no oxidative feature, how come we're getting oxidative symptoms on the startup? Well, it's because you're just put a communication network into play. Imagine, a body of 50 trillion cells. The number trillion is very hard to, that's 1,000 billion, right? So 50,000 billion cells is a typical human body. And now you take away the wireless network for 5 years or 10 years, or that wireless network is starting to age from age 2 on. And now you're a 38 or 45-year-old individual. You were already decaying from age 2, and then you got hit by antibiotics, and you got all this microbiome screw up, and 1,000 things happen. And now you have almost no communication network. During those decades or years, you've been accumulating injuries all the way from the DNA, all the way to the protein structure, toxins sitting within the cell. That wireless network suddenly gets poured on and the lights flip on in the whole building, and you're like, oh my gosh, I got injury everywhere. The whole system tries to kick in to repair, and you have no fuel. You're depleted, you're worn out, and so now you're running on fumes, and you're feeling that. Why am I running on fumes? I feel like I'm about to collapse at the cellular level. I'm hardly moving. I'm still in bed. You just got to go slower. Don't flip on the building, all the lights in the building. Flip on the entry light, and you start to repair that gut lining with a few drops of Restore. You might just drop 3 to 5 drops in a glass of water, swish in your mouth, swallow that, see how you do there. Turn on the lights there over a couple weeks, and then double the dose. Now you're starting to address the lining of the intestines with the gullet, the gastrointestinal lymphatic tissue. You can imagine now you're turning on more and more lights as you move up to that recommended teaspoon a few times a day. The 5 milliliters or a teaspoon a few times a day, we found that's really addressing the majority of the issues for the majority of the healthy population. Your next question was, well, is it useful to take more? And the cool thing is your body's a biologic assay. It's your biologic assay. There's no doctor or set of blood work that will ever be smarter than your body is to you. And so I can't really predict what exactly the right dose is for you or the right usage is. Instead, you're going to have to just experiment with that a bit. And so I would say, again, you're going to get probably 80% of the benefit from a few times a day with 5 milliliters, but just give it a shot for a week. What happens if you take 15 milliliters, which is a tablespoon? Take a tablespoon for a few times a week. You've got a benign thing that's turning on the lights. How many lights have been turned off, and how far do you have to push to get those lights on in the system?
One of the things that I just wanted to cover briefly, because when I've shared Restore with people in the past, they've often come back and asked about the nickel and the glutamic acid. My understanding is the amount of these things that's in Restore is probably less than what we get from our healthy diet. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, exactly right. Far less. Again, you're looking at about the amount you would see in the skin of a sweet potato. And so you're looking at this trace amount of mineral that's just present in soil. That's why it's going to show up in a root vegetable. It's why it's going to show up in the skin of a potato. It's why it's going to show up in the skin of a beet. These nutrients are always there. They're critical building blocks. Just like we've started to pathogen belief our microbiome, we've done the same thing to the periodic table, where we say arsenic's bad for us. Manganese can be bad for us at certain doses. Selenium's bad for us at certain doses. So it turns out that any of those micronutrients at high doses can actually be a toxin to us. But deplete the body completely of any of those micronutrients within the periodic table, and you've got yourself a problem too. There's a role for nickel. There's a role for all of the periodic chart in your body. One of the guys who's done a really great job with this is Dr. Ulrich. He wrote a book called Minerals of the Genetic Code. And one of the things he's demonstrated is there is a single element within the periodic chart that sits within each enzyme. Enzymes are large proteins that are produced by your DNA, translates to an RNA to a protein, and protein then folds in this complex machine. And that machine, called an enzyme, needs a central element, which might be cobalt, for example. And then the whole protein structure will fold around a single ion of metallic cobalt. Well, the cobalt, if you actually feed animals cobalt, they'll actually get toxic on cobalt and they have health problems. And so it's these trace amounts that are critical for things like protein folding and enzyme function and all this, and yet overdose can be a real problem. So we need to be less fearful of the periodic chart and more sense of, okay, trace amounts of the earth itself is exactly what we grew up in. It's where life sprung from. We need to stop diseasifying that periodic chart and start really believing in balance. The power of the balance comes from the microbiome. And so silica is a good example of this. Silica in the mineral form is actually very oxidative and depletes bone mineral density. And silica in the form that's been organified by either microbiome or by a plant is actually easily integrated into bone mineral density and that kind of thing. And so you can have literally the opposite effect. Selenium, another good example. Selenium, the mineral, will shut down thyroid function. Selenium that's been processed appropriately by the microbiome can actually be helpful to thyroid function. And so you can get this kind of yin-yang opposite effect of the minerals versus the mineral state of a periodic chart element versus the organified bacteria, processed element.
So when you talk about organified silica, is that there's specific silica products that something's been done to them, or that your healthy microbiome is then able to move the silica through that process?
I think it's both. So if you had a really super healthy microbiome, which I'm not sure any of us do, the American Gut Project is a big genomic project looking at the American gut versus the Hadza tribe in Africa, which is kind of this hunter-gatherer tribe today that's really in the same environment they've been in for thousands of years. We've lost an enormous amount of microbiome. It's the assumption that we've all kind of used to be hunter-gatherers. We don't have that biodiversity anymore. So I'm not sure any of us, I'm not confident in myself. I think I've been on the top 0.1% of American guts now. I've been taking care of it for a long time, first person to be on Restore and things like that. Mm-hmm. And yet I'm not at all confident that I would want to take, mineral silica, because I don't know that I have that niche within my microbiome. So I want to make sure I've got a plant-derived silica, something like horsetail is the plant there.
Right.
You don't need much silica at that point. If you take horsetail, once a week is plenty. Take horsetail supplement once a week, you probably have more than enough silica for your body to deal with.
The other common thing that comes up as a question about Restore is, do I really have to stop taking my probiotics and my digestive enzymes? And so I know the rationale that if you're taking, probiotic every day that has 4 different types of bugs in it, that in and of itself is an imbalance because we need thousands of different things. But is it just not helpful, or is it potentially problematic if someone's taking probiotics and digestive enzymes while they're using Restore?
I don't think probiotics are probably harmful in general. I think that it's hard to prove that they're harmful. I'll put it that way. What we do tend to see is people who've been on probiotics for years and then will suddenly start Restore. They'll tend to have a few days of die-off symptoms where they'll have kind of green stools and it looks like their biome shifting, which means that they've probably created some sort of overgrowth, which was probably not the species they're taking in their mouth. It's probably some other cousin or subspecies that's necessary for the lactobacilli or whatever they're pounding in their mouth at 35 billion copies a day. Your typical probiotic has anywhere from 35 billion now to 1 trillion copies of the same bacteria. So you're really loading the gut with this monoculture. And so the fortunate thing is most probiotics can't colonize the human gut. Most of them are actually derived from cow gut. Cow intestines are way different than human intestines. A rumen gut doesn't have an acidic stomach, lots of differences. And so fortunately, we have a probiotic industry that's built out of the wrong species. And so in that way, it can't really do too much harm because we're not supposed to look like a cow ever. And so I think, by our own kind of mistaken identity of what the microbiome should look like, we've probably produced a probiotic thing that's probably neither helpful or harmful. It's just a lot of bacteria that we're pounding into a state, and that's a lot of money down the drain, if you will. And so I'd say that's the main reason I have people back off probiotics is like, look, you got the wrong biome, doesn't stick, it's too narrow. Mm-hmm. I can't imagine how that's really inducing a healthy gut for you. So that said, there's an occasional patient that'll come along and says, I just feel better when I'm taking this. Well, fine, take that. I'm not going to tell you to stop it if you feel better on it. But I would really challenge you to ask yourself, do I actually feel better when I'm taking my probiotic? For the most part, what happened is you felt better for a few days when you started taking your probiotic, and now you make the assumption, if I stop my probiotic, I'm going to feel worse. When in reality, you may have gotten a few days of shift out of it, and now you can stop it at any time. You're not going to really sense a change.
And on the digestive enzyme front, is that because once you've got the communication network and the biodiversity improving in the gut, that there's just not as much need for those enzymes?
Exactly. Okay. This all comes down to the simple acidification of the stomach. And so we should have a very acid stomach as humans. We should have a pH somewhere around 2.8, 3.4, 4.2 in that range. And so, when we eat a meal, we're going to get very acidic, or we should get very acidic in the stomach. When we're in a non-feed state, that 3.8 to 4.2 range maybe. So we're going to have very acidic, that's down at battery acid levels of pH or lower. And so that's a very acidic stomach. And the digestive enzymes are really coded for which part of the GI tract compared to that acid are they coming in. Your parotid gland and your salivary glands in your mouth are supposed to start the process with something called amylase and a few other digestive enzymes that are supposed to get the process in a medium pH, kind of pH 7.5 to 7 is your mouth, and you've got these enzymes that function very well at that very neutral pH. So amylase starts to digest things, and then you swallow, and then 8 inches later, you're suddenly in a pH of 3.2. Well, now amylase enzyme's probably not working very well at that pH. You've really done its function. Now you're looking towards pepsin and other compounds that might be active in the stomach environment. And then you pass into the duodenum, or the first section of the small intestine. If you have an acidic stomach, you're going to have a huge dump of bile, which has all your biliary acids and digestive enzymes in there, should be coming from that environment. Even then, though, the human contribution to the digestive enzyme or digestive metabolic process is at best 10%. 90% is done by the microbiome. And so you shouldn't even rely on human digestive enzymes. And that's the other kind of fallacy about the digestive enzymes for a healthy gut is, at best, you're supplementing 10% of the enzymes that should be working at your gut. The other 90% should be coming from the microbiome. So recover your microbiome, you'll really ratchet up your ability to do the 90% of the work. And then the question is, well, as long as you got an acid stomach, I would stop that. So what do? I usually put people on Restore, HCl with betaine. HCl with betaine has a great influence. Betaine is very rich in glycine, which is helpful because glyphosate screws up our glycine. Glycine is the backbone of glyphosate. So glyphosate will screw up our glycine reservoir. So I love starting HCl with betaine because I'm acidifying, providing glycine, and getting the whole communication network up and going with 2 products.
Beautiful.
And I usually stop digestive enzymes and probiotics at that point.
Can the Restore product be added to a morning shake or smoothie, or is it more effective taken on its own?
It can totally be added. Yeah, I think, for myself, it may be all in my head, but when I swish Restore in my mouth at that 100% concentration, gargle it, and then swallow it, I can feel every one of those compartments respond. I can feel my salivary glands respond. I can feel my immune system in my throat shift. I can feel less scratchiness, less swelling of my adenoids, all of that. I can feel that reduction in stress in real time. I love that, partially because I don't have a huge attention span, so I need to know it's working now. And so I'm not terribly interested in waiting a couple hours to see if I feel better. So just start that process right away, get that thing improved. That's why I love the nasal preparation. Spray down your sinuses. You're going to feel that shift in 30 seconds. And remember the importance of the sinuses when we're talking about small intestine and small bowel overgrowth. Where are the bacteria coming from for small bowel overgrowth? Well, they're not actually crawling up from your colon to infect your first part of your small intestine. They're coming back down from the top. Postnasal drainage is among the number 1 conditions that Americans face. We breathe pollen, pollution, all kinds of stuff, and we have a leaky membrane from how much glyphosate we breathe. And now all of that just junk goes right into our immune system. So we get this chronic congestion that drips down our throat all night long. During the night, you're not eating, and so the pH tends to rise in the stomach, and so you're going to kill less bacteria overnight, and you're dripping all night long down your throat. Now suddenly you wake up in the morning, you've got a bunch of sinus bacteria that have now shown up in the small intestine. If that's the case, then you're going to develop small bowel overgrowth. So if you're under-acidified and you've got post-nasal drainage, you're going to develop some degree of small bowel overgrowth of gram-positives and other bacteria that shouldn't be present in the small intestine.
So in the chronic Lyme realm, people often talk, particularly in the mold illness realm, they often talk about MARCoNS or this staph overgrowth in the sinuses. There's also people that suggest that if you've been in a water-damaged building for long periods of time, that you could have colonization of aspergillus or other things potentially growing in your sinuses and in your gut. So does using the nasal version of Restore, does that potentially help to provide that communication system so that the microbiome then is able to kind of shift in a direction that maybe wouldn't support the overgrowth of these water damaged building microbes, for example?
Yeah, so the nasal spray is really just changing the terrain again. Okay. And so if you change the terrain, then there's not going to be no reason for the aspergillus to be there. I think the aspergillus and all these different compounds are there again for a reason. We know fungi are very good at detoxing environments. The mycelium in the soil, that's why it's there. It's to get communication networks up and going, distribute nutrients, and detox the environment. And so, we blame a lot of these funguses and fungal toxins on things. Everybody knows, peanuts are bad because they have aspergillus. Well, there's actually no evidence in history that eating peanuts is bad for your health if your microbiome is intact. I suspect that fungus has probably been around in our agricultural environment since the beginning of time, and it plays important roles. It's when your microbiome is shot and you have overgrowth and you have no intact membrane, you have leaky sinuses, you have leaky gut, you got leaky brain. Now you throw aspergillus into the mix. Now you can get symptoms from that because the mold toxins are ending up in the wrong place. Mm-hmm. I have a feeling those mold toxins are doing good work on the front end of killing bacteria that shouldn't be present and other things. So again, less concept of disease, much more concept of the terrain needs to improve. How do you improve the terrain? Get the coherent tight junctions, fix the boundaries, and then get the microbiome diversified.
And is the nasal product the same solution as the oral product, just in a spray bottle, or is there something different about the same thing?
Okay. It tends to lose its atomizing effect, so we spent quite a bit of time finding a bottle that could get the particle size quite small of the rest.
But once you go through a bottle, you can just refill it from your
you can refill it, but just keep in mind, and you can kind of tell, but after 3 or 4 uses, you're going to start to get clogging of the device, and so the spray is going to look less fine. It's pretty obvious. It starts to just spit at you instead of being a fine mist. So just make sure it's fine misting on you really well, and you'll be confident it's still working.
A couple of years ago, I heard you talk about Restore, and someone asked about the use of Restore as an enema. Is there value in doing that, in that it provides some additional benefit that taking it orally maybe is not? And if you do that, would it be diluted or the substance as you purchase it?
We've used it as 100% concentration. The only time that I really find that helpful is if you got some sort of reason to do it locally there. If you've got, local inflammatory process going on, then, bringing in a communication network to help turn back on your endogenous anti-inflammatory system and get the network back up and all. But the reality is you're reaching very little distance there, right? With a typical retention enema, you might be getting 6, at best 8 to 10 inches of intestine. You've got 25 feet. So you're much better off as far as just real estate of going through the mouth. So you hit your entire gut membrane, and if you do the combination of sinus spray and oral.
Okay.
Rectal, maybe you get a few inches of penetration at a higher concentration. Maybe that's helpful. Maybe it's not. By and large, I find the no-brainer, the biggest bang for the buck is oral.
Let's talk about any potential contraindications or people that maybe shouldn't use Restore, if there are any. I do know I've heard a few practitioners talk about in those with SIBO, for example, that you mentioned, or maybe in those that have mast cell activation and histamine intolerance, that they either have to start really slow, or maybe they'll support those issues first and then bring in Restore. Does either SIBO or histamine intolerance affect how you might apply Restore in a particular person?
Yeah, always nasals. If you see SIBO, you got to treat the sinuses over and over again. Yeah, and then acidify the stomach. So if somebody comes in, they say, I've got SIBO, I'm going to start them on, once an hour, every hour. Really frequent use of the nasal, and then get them taking HCl with betaine, a couple of tablets, 2 to 4 tablets with every meal.
But there's no reason that they can't also then incorporate Restore orally. They just may need to also start slowly and then work up as they tolerate it.
In general, they don't really respond negatively. Yeah, oral is totally fine. And I can't even think of a single situation where I've had like a super sensitive SIBO patient. Typically, the SIBO patient will be pretty able to tolerate the oral at normal usage.
It would seem to me that a lot of people are doing low histamine diets, but it would seem to me that if you increase the integrity of the gut lining, that you have fewer of those potentially reacting food particles getting into the circulation or into, outside of the gut. So wouldn't a focus on leaky gut also help to minimize those histamine reactions?
No question.
Okay.
Yeah, we see this all the time. The food sensitivities tend to reduce even within a few weeks. If you've got a real food allergy where you've got hives and anaphylaxis, we want to work with your allergist and things like that. But if it's the kind of thing where you get a little brain fog and you get a little this or that when you eat gluten or whatever it is, you're going to find improvement typically within weeks. And again, it's an interesting thing. Keep in mind that this is really a story about Roundup and glyphosate, because if you're a gluten sensitive or food sensitive patient, you may have experienced going over to Europe, and suddenly you're in the streets of Paris and you're eating 2 or 3 croissants a day, and you have no brain fog, you have no bloating, you feel fantastic, you're starting to feel sexy, like you must be a Parisian. In fact, what's happening is you don't have a glyphosate exposure, so you don't have gluten sensitivity. And our group has shown, and we published a peer-reviewed journal article on this, is the synergy between gluten and glyphosate is profound in breaking down that tight junction barrier system. So there's a huge synergy between glyphosate that's now sensitizing the gut lining to gluten and other compounds that will now create that big leaky gut.
I want to jump in a little bit to some comments about hydration and detoxification. I've heard you talk recently with Dr. Mercola, fantastic interview that you guys did on that topic as well. But tell us a little bit about hydration, what percentage of the population is dehydrated, and then how does Restore potentially help with the hydration aspect of health as well?
I think 100% of us are dehydrated. I think the only population that I could think of that are probably well hydrated is maybe a newborn Hadza tribe baby over in West Africa. As soon as we start to age, by definition, we're dehydrating. The hallmark of an aging cell is loss of communication network in the redox environment and dehydration. That's basically sums up the entire aging process. If you are fully hydrated, you don't age because you're scrubbing your cell beautifully. We sell all these detox products in the integrative medicine environment, right? You detox box this, detox box that. All of that is a little chasing after the wind, because in fact, the only thing that can really scrub a cell is water. And if you can get water inside a cell, that's going to be your ultimate salvation of cleansing the system of any kind of heavy metal or anything else. You're going to have to get water inside the cell. So how do you get water inside the cell? Because there's a misperception about what the word hydration means. There's hydration of your vascular space. If I put an IV in my arm and give myself a liter of saline, I'm going to have a very robust volume within my blood vessels. But if I'm chronically ill, or if I'm 85 years old, I'm going to pee all that water out before it ever gets inside of a cell. And so as we become chronically ill and chronically dehydrated from a chronic inflammatory state where we're leaking all over, you get leaky gut, you get leaky blood vessels, you get leaky brain, you get leaky kidney. Now your whole system is having a very hard time holding on to free water. As you lose the ability for free water, you lose the ability to get nutrient into the body as well. The cell membrane, now we're not talking about the whole huge gut membrane that covers 2 tennis courts. Let's now think down to a single cell, tiny microscopic cell. And that cell has to have a very high electrical charge across it as well. And so the way that we show leaky gut in the lab is we take a small intestine and show a drop in electrical resistance across that. And so you hold a high resistance, you got a healthy bowel, suddenly lose your resistance, you've got a leaky gut. The same thing then echoes at the single cell level, where there should be this huge electrical charge held across that. And we can measure that with a little device in clinic called the phase angle. It's basically an impedance monitor that measures the resistance across your whole body. A couple electrodes on your wrist and hand, a couple on your ankle and foot. Test laying flat, see the whole total body impedance, calculate with your body weight, a couple other parameters, and we get something called the phase angle number. That number now reflects what is that electrical charge across the single cell membrane. The reason that's important is if you're lacking that electrical charge, you can no longer pull water inside the cell. So there's vascular hydration, intravascular, which means you just gave yourself an IV or you drank a bunch of water and it absorbed through the gut, and now you've got water in the blood vessels. Now you got to have an electrical charge in each cell, pull that water across, which will then allow for good sodium potassium movement, electrolyte management, all of that stuff, and then detoxification on the back end. So how do we hydrate? Step one is get water inside your body, and that's where Restore comes in. If you've got a leaky colon, if you've got a leaky small intestine, you're going to have a hard time getting water into the system to begin with. And you're going to have irritable bowel syndrome, right? You're going to have a lot of days of just watery stools because you can't get that water pulled across the colon because the colon is so inflamed and thickened and not transiting water across an electrically charged membrane. So water just sloshing around in your gut, and you feel heavy and bloaty all day, and you've got liquid stools. As you take Restore and you support the whole extracellular matrix and the tight junctions, now you can pull water intravascularly. Now you got to get the water from the vasculature into the cell, and that's where your electrolytes come in. And so that's where we start adding, electrolyte powders and things like this to your water to get that extra charge to start to draw the water into the cell. And so our hydration protocol, we usually go back and forth between distilled water, which actually pulls toxin and junk out of the cell, and electrolyte-rich water, which dumps water back into the cell. And then we use that as a pumping action. Every 30 minutes you do distilled water, and then followed by, on the 30 minutes again, the electrolyte water. So you're pushing and pulling water in and out of the cell by the alternation every 30 minutes of either distilled or electrolyte water. You do that from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., you get a big hydration effect.
So using Restore and the electrolytes to get water inside the cells, it sounds like we can then think of Restore as also a tool that's supporting detoxification. And it sounds like supporting it at a much more fundamental level than a lot of the other things we're potentially doing today to support detoxification.
That's right. And if you decide you're going to do a detox product, make sure you're keeping in the back of your mind, man, if I'm going to spend $500 or $1,000 on a big detox kit, I sure as heck better be hydrated during that time to make this thing work. And so just start working that realization of the importance of, get your macro boundaries intact, get the Restore going there, sinuses, small intestine, colon, renal tubules, vascular tubules, get that all supported. Then push the water hydration, do 3 days of intensive there. And then you do a detox box on top of that. Now I think you're going to get some traction. Everything from curcumin and turmeric all the way down to your garlic and all the other compounds that I love throwing into the mix. Those things actually now get a lot of traction because they're getting inside the cells. They're encouraging the scrubbing action to go.
So you mentioned bioimpedance analysis, or BIA, and phase angle. Does the incorporation of Restore lead to observable shifts in phase angle over time?
Yeah, we see that over and over again. It's frustratingly slow. We have another product coming down the pike that we've been working on for some time. It's a vascular product to support the vascular flow. And that product looks to be probably a huge piece of the reason why just Restore alone is extracellular matrix. We got to change flow dynamics within the blood vessel and within the extracellular fluid to actually get that tight junction system or the phase angles to respond quicker. It's a holy grail for us, because what we find is that it's very difficult to get a life-threatening cancer if you've got a high phase angle. And vice versa, it's very difficult to heal from a cancer if your phase angle is low. Mm-hmm. And so if you can't get water inside the cell, the chance of you bouncing back from a cancer or any other life-threatening disease is low. So we need more and more tools to be researched and developed over time to really help that intracellular hydration potential maximize.
And have you observed that as you become more hydrated, that people that are electromagnetically sensitive, all of these EMF intolerant people, which is probably all of us, we maybe just don't recognize it or feel it to the degree that some others do, but does that hydration then make us less susceptible to the negative effects of EMFs?
Yeah, two things going on there. So I can't guarantee it's just the hydration that's reducing those symptoms. It's a really complex array of events that are happening, but it's all in the extracellular matrix again. And so the tight junctions are the Velcro spot welds on the apical side of your gut membrane, vascular membrane, blood-brain barrier. And so you can picture a large cell, food's passing over here, your large cell, you got food here, large cells here, and you got your immune system over here. So the cell is really trying to protect your immune system, blood system, and trying to feed it all the right nutrients. So it's trying to passage the correct stuff and keep the others out. Sitting behind the tight junction barrier is the gap junctions. And the gap junctions are beautiful. If you want to blow your mind, go Google image gap junction electron microscope. These things are beautiful. They look on the surface like a cable. So under a high electron microscopy, you can see something that looks like a cable kind of welding together two cells. Then at higher resolution, you realize that each fiber within the cable is actually hollow. And what you have is over 10,000 little fibers that look exactly like fiber optic cables, to the degree that even on the end of every one of those, you've got an aperture, a structure that looks like the aperture on a camera that opens and closes with a kind of a fin-like motion. There's an aperture on the end of every one of these tiny, tiny tubules. And this point we're like 1/100th of the width of a human hair, and yet the architecture is spectacularly beautiful and ornate. And so these are the fiber optic cables that should keep one cell communicating with another cell. And again, there's 10,000 in a single gap junction and many, many gap junctions around a single cell. So you may have hundreds of thousands of gap junctions that are trafficking light energy from one cell cytoplasm to the next. That's cool. That means you're more electrical and light being than you are molecular. And I really believe that's true. We're more atomic physics than we are molecular biology. Mm-hmm. At the atomic physics level, what we're passaging is light energy that's communicating from one cell to the next. Here's who I am at the cell identity level. Here's who you are. Here's what I need. Here's what I can give you. There's all of this traffic of fiber optic information. You take Roundup and we show lysis of the whole extracellular matrix, you just lost your fiber optic cables, not just the tight junctions and leak. You just lost your inherent intrinsic network of communication within the cytoplasm of the cell. So now you've got a serious problem. And this is, I believe, when we become very sensitive to EMFs. Electrical man-made fields that are very common now, everything from 4G and 5G coming down the pike now. So you have 4G, 5G, you got Wi-Fi routers in your house, you've got Bluetooth this in your car, Bluetooth that. We've got the Internet of Everything coming, IoT. Internet of Everything is where your toaster has a chip in it, your refrigerator's got a chip in it, and everything is Bluetoothing together. We're about to be so surrounded, and we already are, by all of this electromagnetic field. It's subtle, though. It's subtle energy field. And I believe if you're really intact and your whole extracellular matrix is robust, your energy far exceeds that of the EMFs from outside of you. It's when we add Roundup and glyphosate to the system and you start to get chronic leak and you can't repair fast enough, the microbiome is gone and you don't know what proteins to make, you don't need, you need gap junctions and tight junctions. Matrix is falling apart. Now you bombard with 4G and 5G, and you immediately get a migraine headache. You immediately get nausea. You get POT syndrome, where you suddenly orthostatic and you can't stand up, and your autonomic nervous system is freaking out on you. That state of real EMF sensitivity is a symptom of a deeper problem. You've disconnected at the extracellular matrix. So when we start Restore, we see, again, it's kind of like phase angle, that over the next months, we're going to see a restoration of that whole system. You're going to start to propagate your own electrical energy and light energy through fiber optic systems rather than your primary signal happening from a Bluetooth router.
And when you talked about glyphosate kind of shutting down this whole system, we obviously want to minimize our intake of glyphosate, but as you pointed out, it's not really possible to completely avoid it. And so through the use of Restore, we're at least able to mitigate the damage that creates, correct?
Yeah, and so that's some of our peer-reviewed journal articles are showing that once you've covered the membrane with Restore, you can expose the glyphosate. You see no drop. In fact, you see an increase in the phase or the electrical charge called the TEER, transepithelial electroresistance, basically the macro version of phase angle of the gut lining or vascular lining. So you'll see TEER go up, not down, when you add the terahydrite, even if you're adding the glyphosate. We've taken that up to very high concentration, so we can expose 20,000 times more Roundup or glyphosate than you've seen in your diet, and we continue to do a nice protection of that extracellular matrix with that communication network.
I want to wrap one last question in before my final question, and that is, since we're talking so much about hydration and the impact of that on detoxification and how toxicity plays a role in why maybe we have many of these microbes, and the importance of really focusing on detox, I want to just have you comment a couple of things about magnesium. I know you've talked about Epsom salt baths and topical magnesium, even float tanks, which I recently had the opportunity to try after hearing you talk about them. So how important is magnesium in terms of hydration, detoxification, mitochondrial function, and even potentially then the resistance to the EMFs around us?
Joe Mercola and I both are pretty convinced at this point. Joe Mercola has done a good job thinking about EMFs. He's working on a book right now on EMF toxicity, and I think that he's right that magnesium is going to pull a big supportive role in reducing EMF toxicity. Much of the toxicity of EMF seems to be disruption of the calcium channel in the surface of our cells, and that calcium channel is really modulated strongly by magnesium. And so I think magnesium is big on that previous subject we were just on the EMF toxicity. But we find that all of us are relatively magnesium deficient. We were supposed to be exposed to magnesium not so much through our diet, but much more through our daily bathing. Anything from a mountain stream to the ocean water is supposed to have a lot of magnesium salts in it, and a variety of them, not just one. And so it's that variety of magnesium in our environment that used to absorb through our skin that really kept us replete. And now that we're all just on municipal water, chlorinated water, all this, we've lost that normal magnesium salt environment that really kept us sustained. And so I think the majority of us are mag deficient. If you test magnesium levels in the bloodstream, they're going to be extremely consistent. Very few of us will actually have a low magnesium in the bloodstream because the cellular environment has to maintain that. And so we'll drag all of the last reservoirs out of our body of magnesium to keep the bloodstream replete. And so I don't think a blood level magnesium is a very good measure of your total body mag load. If you go to a daily supplement of magnesium, we've seen that again and again help a lot of things, from chronic fatigue to any number of things can just be helped by just supporting your normal autonomic nervous system with magnesium. With the case of a float tank, they'll put 850 pounds of Epsom salt into a single bath. That's a ridiculous sum. You can imagine, a 50-pound bag of salt, you're carrying in 15 or 20 of those massive bags into one little bathtub. Mm-hmm. And so you're filling it to a concentration where you're at 25% concentration of salt in the water, not like the usual 1%. And so now you've got 800 pounds that's holding you up in the water. You cannot sink in a salt tank for a float tank. Your body is so buoyant that you're literally pushed to the surface because there's 800 pounds pushing you upwards, literally. And so you're just buoyant in these baths, which is a fantastic experience. You can go through a sensory deprivation kind of experience in a dark float tank where you can really, some people will have, like after decades of meditation, they may be able to reach the same place. But somebody who's never meditated in their life can go and spend an hour in a float tank and get one of these rebirthing experiences where they kind of have a past life regressions, all kinds of crazy stuff can come out just because you're in this really beautiful sensory deprivation spot while being soaked in magnesium, which is supporting the whole electrical transfer of information through your whole extracellular matrix and beyond. So you couldn't find a much bigger proponent of magnesium than I am.
Yeah, and I had done it once in the past, and then after I heard on another interview that you had some of them installed recently into your clinic because you felt they were so compelling from a health perspective, that convinced me to sign up for the subscription to the local float tank place. So that was thanks for that. So my last question is, what are some of the key things that you do on a daily basis in support of your own health?
Sleep. Yeah, it's so important. It's so easy to spend tons of money on supplements and, geek out all night long on podcasts to find out that it's, 1:30 in the morning, you're finally falling asleep and your alarm goes off at 5:30 a.m. to get you to the gym. And you find yourself after a few years of quote unquote taking care of yourself in a massively sleep deprived state. And so the internet's a scary, slippery slope, so make sure your Wi-Fi router turns itself off at 11 or whatever you want to set your thing out. Make sure you're getting at least 6 hours of uninterrupted sleep. Most people need closer to 7.5 to 8 hours to get good quality rest and feel restored. Make sure you're getting catch-up sleep. And so, on the weekends, don't just over-program yourself with a bunch of outdoor stuff. Every couple of weekends, just say, you know what, I'm just going to catch up on sleep this weekend. Not only am I going to allow my body to sleep in if it needs, I'm going to take some naps this weekend. And really give yourself the freedom to nap. Remember the power of micro naps. And so, if you're cranking through a busy day and you're like, man, I am hitting the wall, I'm going to go drink 2 cups of coffee. Well, you could do that. Or maybe you should take a 10-minute, power nap and settle down, close your eyes, meditate for a few minutes. And if you fall asleep for a few minutes, great. If you just sit there and meditate for 10 minutes, that's just as good. So get that quiet space for the brain, sleep, meditation, and then the rest is nutrition and beyond. So keep it going.
Fantastic. Very good. I want to thank you for spending time sharing all of your knowledge. Obviously, being triple board certified, you're super, super bright. You have great products. But the thing that I always heard people say and do still hear people say about you when your name comes up is that he's someone who cares about people. And I don't hear that a lot. And I just really think that that's a nice thing for people to say about someone else. And so I think you really do care about people. You can tell that your passion comes through even in this discussion, and that you're working hard to come up with products and ideas and solutions to help people have better lives. So thank you so much for spending time with us today.
I appreciate you being part of that mission. Take care.
Thanks. To learn more about today's guest, visit restoreforlife.com. That's restore, the number 4, life.com. restoreforlife.com. Thanks for your interest in today's show. If you'd like to follow me on Facebook or Twitter, you can find me there as Better Health Guy. To support the show, please visit betterhealthguy.com/donate. If you'd like to be added to my newsletter, visit betterhealthguy.com/newsletters. And this and other shows can be found on YouTube, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and Spotify.
Thanks for listening to this Better Health Guy blogcast with Scott, your Better Health Guy. To check out additional shows and learn more about Scott's personal journey to better health, please visit betterhealthguy.com.